Not so long ago, LED lights were a relatively new technology in the filmmaking world, and most serious professionals wouldn't have considered bringing them on set. Obviously, that changed pretty quickly, and these days I'm seeing more and more LED lights on big productions. Aputure was probably more responsible for this shift than any other company, and now I'm seeing Aputure 300s, 600s, and 1200s on all sorts of projects, including a multi-million-dollar an episode doc series I finished a few months ago. But as good as Aputure lights have gotten, and even though they're still amazing value for what they offer, they're still not cheap, and a 600D Pro can run up to nearly $2,000 with the base model coming in at $1,100 at the current sale price. So when SmallRig reached out to me and asked if I wanted to test out their new 450D light that costs $100 less than the 600D despite posting pretty similar output numbers on paper, I was really excited to see if this budget alternative could be a good way for indie filmmakers to get a big light into their kit without breaking the bank. So in this video, I'm gonna run the 450D through a couple basic lighting scenarios where I would normally want to use a big light like this to see how the new guy in the market stacks up to the reigning king and whether or not it's going to be a permanent part of my lighting kit for documentary work. Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Luke Forsyth, and on this channel I teach the skills and tricks I've learned over 10 years working as a documentary filmmaker and photographer. Okay, right off the bat, let's get the disclosure out of the way. This video is not sponsored.
I will not bow to any sponsor.
SmallRig did send the light and the softbox to me, and I've worked with them in the past, but there was no money involved, and I'm free to say whatever I want. And spoiler alert, I'm going to, because unlike a bunch of reviews I saw on this light, my thoughts aren't all positive. I've been an Aputure fan since the early days when they burst onto the filmmaking scene, and my very first light ever was one of their Lightstorm 1x1 panels. I forget what it's called exactly. But since then I've used most of their lights. I've owned a bunch of them and have pretty much been very happy with them across the board. I'm not married to any brand though, and I'm happy to use whatever is right for the job. So when SmallRig started making lights, I agreed to try out their much smaller 120D. I'll just ignore how weird it is that they copied Aputure's naming structure almost exactly.
You're copying me!
But if you missed that video from a while back, the short version is that I really like that light and I still bring it on shoots with me today. It's small, affordable, and it does what I needed to do at a lower price point. So what's not to love? So when SmallRig sent out the 450D, I was really excited to see if it could become my new heavy hitter in the lighting department and stop my need to constantly run Aputure 600s when I need a really big light on set. I'm not an overly technical guy, and I'd rather leave that stuff to the pros like Gerald Undone, so I'm not going to talk about the tungsten equivalent numbers or the CRI values or any of that stuff because it's already all out there. Instead, I'm going to put this light through its paces in the type of situations where I'd normally need a light that's more powerful than the Aputure 300D that I already own. So without wasting any more time, let's jump into the first setup. So we're in my tiny living room, and the first test we're going to do is get the light out of the box and see if I can fill this whole room with believable looking daylight, even though it's getting darker and darker outside. So like all of these lighting companies now, they all kind of make the same sort of cases. Sure, there's variations on what makes some of them better. It does come in a nice box. Everything's nicely packed away. So about what you'd expect for a almost $1,000 light fixture. This connector seems pretty solid. Like the light itself is made out of decent plastic, and I'd be really worried though if this was made out of plastic, but it does feel like most of it's metal. It feels really solid, and actually it's a pretty clever design. No worries about the light falling off, so good job on that. So one thing you can notice right away is that the build quality on everything, you can see where they saved their money. It's not bad exactly, but everything's just a little bit less refined than you might be used to with like the Aputure series. You know, instead of that big braided cable, you've got this wire. Does exactly the same thing. So that's up to you how much you care about those kind of things, or if raw output is more important than things like braided cables, but I notice the difference. We're just gonna put on the controller box. This is extremely cute. I'm just noticing this thing is adorable. This light is normally controlled all from the back of the unit. And if you're gonna raise it up on a stand, that's kind of a big deal. So SmallRig was nice enough to send me this controller unit that means you can clamp it onto a stand. It attaches with magnets. Pretty cool little thing, I guess. It feels, again, like they saved some money on this design, but should work. So if I knew I was gonna shoot a scene around dusk and I wasn't gonna be able to control the light coming in through the windows, I would wanna light this whole room up. And that's one of the main ways I could see myself using a big light like the 450D. So we're not gonna win any cinematography awards with this. This is just a shot straight on of a couch. But let's see the difference right now versus after we turn on the SmallRig. That's a pretty big difference. I mean, it doesn't look great because it's just going straight into the wall. It would probably be better with the softbox or with a bit more diffusion, or if we bounced it into a piece of diffusion cloth and then back at the scene rather than just right up into this hard light. If we fiddle with it a bit, we can give the illusion that it's just broad daylight the whole time we're filming in here. As long as we don't film so long that it gets clearly dark outside, we can keep working in here for as long as we need. So the other way that I could see using a light like this in here would be to motivate window lighting. So we're gonna put the softbox on, roll it into the corner right up against the window, and see if we can get a believable window light coming, even though the light outside is getting darker and darker. All right, so we got the softbox out. I'm used to using normally the light dome system from Aputure, and sort of consistently, like I'm finding with this, they cut corners on build quality to make the light cheaper. So it doesn't set up quite as nicely as the Aputure system, but it is big. It didn't take long. If you have the Aputure softboxes, I don't know that I'd recommend replacing it with one of these. So I just knocked the control box off of this little magnet thing for like the 8th time. So it's a nice idea, but this would not stand up to what I normally put my gear through, to be honest. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is simulate light coming through this window. We're filming this in my apartment, and I never really intended for this to be a lighting tutorial on different kinds of setups. I just wanted to see what kind of output I could get out of this light to see if it could, you know, replicate the sun. It can. The power, to me, the shot looks natural, but its huge size is also kind of a problem. It does take up a pretty significant amount of floor space, especially this softbox, which is probably almost 4 feet deep. So if you're used to working in confined rooms, I don't know if this is gonna work for you. Okay, so the 450D handled that situation pretty well, but that's not so surprising considering its raw output. It did a good job of lighting up a dark space, and it probably could have handled a much bigger room than my tiny apartment, but that's sort of to be expected for a light this bright. My 300D could have done the job, to be honest, and probably even something much smaller, like even a 120D could have worked. So if you're mainly working in smaller spaces, this massive output is probably overkill. When I tried to expose for the light through the window outside and then match the exposure with the 450D, it also handled that pretty well. But again, no big surprise. Overpowering window light in an interview setting is probably one of the most common situations where I'd need a strong light, and it did pass the test, though not with a ton of output to spare. So in indoor situations, the 450D performs well and has probably all the power you'd need in most cases. But the more I used it, the more I started to realize how SmallRig had managed to get the price so low while matching Aputure's output on the more expensive version, and that's through build quality and design. If you've ever used an Aputure light, you'll know that one of their best features is the way the control box and the ballast are all combined into a single unit that clamps onto the stand, at least for all their lights made in the last few years, that is. Since I haven't used many non-Aputure LEDs, I guess I just kinda took this whole system for granted, but when using the SmallRig, I realized what a good piece of design it really is. Instead of a single unit, with the SmallRig you get a giant power brick that seems like it weighs almost as much as the light itself. And because it doesn't attach to the stand, you've got a lot more cables running from the light to the ground, which means more things to trip on, and it makes it harder to move around. On top of that, all the controls are up on the light fixture itself, which means that as soon as you raise it to a certain height, like above your head, you can't see what you're doing anymore and you have to lower it or use the app. And the app does work, but in a fast-paced environment where you're trying to make quick adjustments, I personally would much rather be able to turn a dial than have to pull my phone out. I love the fact that all these lights have apps, don't get me wrong, and in the right situations they're amazing, but on a big documentary set, especially if you're dealing with multiple lights from multiple manufacturers, the need to use an app just slows me down. Personally, that is. Now, SmallRig does have a solution to this, and that's the additional control box that they were nice enough to send me with the light. And that means that you can get the controls down to a more usable height. But at $79 for the unit, it cuts into the savings a fair bit, which is sort of the main advantage of this light. And even though the little control box thing with the magnet clamp is a cool idea in theory, in practice it's really easy to knock off, and it's not nearly as sturdy as the feeling of the solid chunk of aluminum with that super clamp that Aputure ships with its bigger lights. I knock the box off so often, even in my apartment, that I'm pretty sure if I took this thing into a real dock shooting environment out in the world, that it would probably end up smashed into a bunch of pieces pretty soon. I've never felt like that using Aputure stuff, and for me, it's a real concern because I just don't have the time to be super careful with my gear. One thing I will say though is that at least the way it mounts to the stand feels solid, and it uses a sort of tripod head system that feels good and like it's made of metal, so it's not all bad. For indoor use, the light passed the test, though I was already finding myself getting a little bit annoyed with the user experience, like I said. But the real test is how it performs outside, because for me, the main reason to have a light bigger than a 300D is to fight the sun. So we've got Scott sitting in the interview chair. He's filming me. Right now, we have all the lights off, or the light off. What I want out of a big light, this is one of the main scenarios where a big light is super useful. I want to be able to fight the sun and really fill in all those shadows on his face. So let's see if the SmallRig is up to it. Well, that's 100% intensity. It is doing what I need it to do, but just barely. If I'm being perfectly honest, it's not as bright as I thought it would be. We are outside on an overcast day. It's not that bright. So if it was full sun right now, I don't think this would do it. So if you don't do a ton of shooting outside, this might not be the end of the world for you. But for me, it does impact one of the lights, or one of the things I would like to use the light most for. So something to be aware of. All right, so in an outdoor situation, the 450D did manage to fill in the shadows like I needed it to, but it was at 100% brightness and the subject was in the shade. If he'd been in direct light, I don't think it would have been strong enough, but then again, the Aputure 600D likely wouldn't have been able to do it either. For that, you'd probably need something like a 1200D equivalent, but so far, the 450D is the strongest light SmallRig makes, so if you think you'd need more output to battle the sun in direct light, there really isn't a budget option from SmallRig yet. And I have to say, I kept getting more and more annoyed with the build quality as I worked with the 450D. I probably knocked the control box off like 3 or 4 more times, and this time it was cracked off of hard lumber instead of a carpet. And just in general, everything felt a little janky. I found the softbox really hard to attach, and when you're setting it up, it's a lot harder to get the spoke things to lock and unlock with something like an Aputure light dome, partly because it's absolutely massive, but also because the system is just a little bit worse. Not to sound like a baby, but when it comes to unlocking the spokes or ribs or whatever you call those things, some of them were so stuck that it legitimately hurt my hands. And you know what? That's to be expected, because how else can they make it cheaper than its rival while getting similar or even more output? But for the way I work, this is a real problem. If you're wanting to take this light onto a commercial set or something where you'd build it once on a big combo stand and maybe wheel it around a little bit and that's it, then this isn't really a huge issue. But dock shooting can get really frantic, and I need super tough gear that I can get up and down very quickly without worrying if it's gonna break something or that I'm gonna waste 5 minutes and cut my finger trying to collapse a softbox. I know it sounds like I'm being really harsh on this light, and I'm not trying to say it's a bad light at all, because it's a lot of output at an extremely competitive price. It also packs up smaller than the 600D, which makes it easier for traveling, though it's still a pretty decent size. For some filmmakers, this could be a great all-in-one light, especially if you find the 300D underpowered, but also don't use bigger lights enough to justify the extra money for the 600D. But for me personally, once you add the control box, which I would say is almost required for how I use this light, it's actually really not much of a savings at all. At the current prices when I recorded this video on Amazon and B&H, the light is $999 and the box is $79 compared to $1,090 for the 600D. So really it's less than a $20 difference, and in exchange, you're really giving up a lot of build quality and design that makes Aputure stuff so nice to use. So if you think you don't need the control box and you can afford to be really careful with your gear, this is a pretty impressive light from a company that's new in the market, and you could get some massive output and also save yourself a bit of cash by sacrificing build and user experience. It's an ambitious light from SmallRig, and it shows how quickly their technology is progressing. And for a filmmaker who just needs raw power on a budget, it could be a good option. But for me and the way I work, it's just not quite there yet, and I'd personally much rather spend $100 more to get a light that's built better and is easier to use. As time goes on, I'm sure SmallRig will find a way to improve all this stuff, and I'm looking forward to that time, but for now, I'm gonna have to pass on this one. Thanks for watching, and hopefully that helped you make up your own mind about whether the savings make sense for your filmmaking needs. And if you like cinematography related gear talks like this, my full course on documentary cinematography is coming very soon, so use the link below to get on the early wait list and get a nice discount when it goes live. See ya!